My children tried to throw me out after my wife died. They never expected my final decision. The locksmith arrived at 9 in the morning, 3 days before my wife's headstone was even set, and my own children stood on the porch to watch him change the locks on the house I had lived in for 31 years. My name is Daniel Cole. I was 68 years old, and I had just buried Margaret, the only woman I had ever loved, when my son Robert handed me a manila folder and told me it would be easier for everyone if I signed the papers inside. "It's just a formality, Dad," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "for your own good." I didn't open the folder that day. I set it on the kitchen counter, next to the coffee mug Margaret used every morning for 20 years, the one with the chipped handle she refused to throw away, and I looked at my son as if I were seeing him for the first time. I want to tell you how it started, because it didn't start with the locksmith. It started 3 weeks earlier, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and wilting flowers, with my wife's hand growing cold in mine. Part 1: The Woman I Buried. Margaret and I met in 1979 at a diner outside Harrisburg. She was a waitress working double shifts to pay for night classes, and I was a 23-year-old mechanic with grease permanently embedded under my fingernails and no idea what I wanted from life except her. We married 11 months later in her mother's backyard, with paper lanterns strung between 2 oak trees and a borrowed record player spinning Otis Redding until midnight. We had nothing: a 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, a car that broke down more than it ran, and each other. Over the next 4 decades, we built something out of nothing. I opened my own auto shop. Margaret went back to school and became a school teacher, the kind children still send letters to 20 years after graduating her class. We raised 3 children, Robert, Susan and Mark, in a house we bought with a mortgage that terrified us and paid off 18 years later with a party in the backyard that lasted until the neighbors complained. I'm not going to pretend our marriage was perfect. We fought. We went through years where the silence between us felt heavier than the arguments. There was a stretch in the late 90s when I drank too much and worked too much and nearly lost her to a version of myself I am ashamed of. She stayed. She fought for us when I didn't have the strength to fight for myself, and I spent the next 25 years trying to earn that back. Margaret was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before she died. We knew from the beginning it wasn't a fight we would win. What we didn't expect was how fast it would take her, or how the people who should have gathered closest to us would instead begin, quietly and carefully, to circle something else entirely. I noticed it first at the hospital. Robert, my eldest, started asking questions that had nothing to do with his mother's comfort and everything to do with paperwork. Had we updated the will? Was the house still in both our names? Did I have a lawyer, or should he recommend one, a friend of his, conveniently? I told myself grief does strange things to people, that maybe this was how my son was coping, by focusing on things he could control while his mother slipped away from things he couldn't. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, because that is what fathers do. That is what I had always done. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in March, with sunlight coming through the blinds in long yellow stripes across the blanket, and my hand in hers. Her last coherent words to me 2 days before were, "Don't let them take the house, Daniel. That's yours, that's ours." I didn't understand then how much she already knew. Part 2: The Folder on the Counter. The funeral was on a Saturday. 300 people came, former students, neighbors, men I'd worked alongside for 30 years. My sister Carol, who flew in from Ohio and held my arm the entire service like she was afraid I might fall through the floor. My children were there too, of course. Robert delivered a eulogy that made half the church weep, full of memories of his mother's kindness, her laugh, the way she made every stray cat in the neighborhood feel like it had a home. Susan read a poem. Mark, my youngest, couldn't get through his sentence without breaking down, and I held him the way I held him when he was 6 years old and had nightmares about the dark. I believed that day that whatever grief does to people, it hadn't broken us. I believed we were still a family. 4 days later, the folder appeared. Robert came by in the afternoon, still wearing his work clothes, a good suit that made him look more like a man closing a deal than a son visiting his grieving father. Susan came with him. Mark did not, which I would later learn was not an accident. "Dad, we need to talk about some things," Robert said, setting the folder on the counter, right next to Margaret's coffee mug. "Practical things. I know it's hard, but they can't wait." The folder contained several documents. A proposal to list the house, our house, the one Margaret and I paid off with our own hands, with a realtor Robert already had a relationship with. A form transferring power of attorney over my finances to Robert for simplicity's sake. And a brochure, glossy and cheerful, for an assisted living facility 45 minutes from where any of my children lived. "You want me to move into a home?" I said. It wasn't a question. We want what's best for you, Susan said quickly. You're 68, Dad. This house is too big for one person. The stairs, the yard, it's a lot. I've managed the stairs and the yard for 31 years. With Mom, Robert said, and something in his voice, not grief, something colder, made the hair on my arms stand up. It's different now. I looked at both of them. My daughter, who used to fall asleep on my chest when she was small, listening to my heartbeat. My son, whom I taught to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings, who called me every year on Father's Day to say thank you for teaching him what it meant to be a man. I'm not selling the house, I said, and I'm not signing anything. Robert's jaw tightened. Dad, be reasonable. This house is worth $400,000. Sitting empty with just you rattling around in it, it's not doing anyone any good. There it was, not concern, arithmetic. It's doing me good, I said quietly. Your mother is in every room of this house. I can smell her perfume in the closet. I can see her handwriting on the calendar in the kitchen. You want me to sell that because it's not doing anyone any good. Susan had the decency to look away. Robert did not. We'll give you some time, he said, like he was doing me a favor, and he left the folder on the counter when they walked out. I didn't sign it. Not that week, not the next. I told myself it was grief talking through my children, that time would soften whatever had hardened in them, that when the initial shock wore off they would remember who we were to each other. I was wrong, it got worse. Part 3, The Locksmiths. Over the following weeks the visits increased, but they stopped feeling like visits and started feeling like negotiations. Robert brought a lawyer friend to help explain the paperwork. Susan started showing up with takeout and gentle questions about whether I'd been forgetting things. Had I taken my blood pressure medication? Did I remember to lock the door? Wasn't it hard cooking for just myself? Innocent questions, except they weren't. They were building a case. Mark, my youngest, called me one night, his voice thick with something between guilt and cowardice. Dad, I don't agree with what Robert's doing, but he says it's for your own good and Susan's on board, and I don't want to be the one who, I don't know. I don't want to cause more problems. So you'll just let it happen, I said. There was a long silence on the line. I'm sorry, Dad. I hung up before he could hear my voice break. The locksmith showed up on a Thursday morning, dispatched by Robert, who had apparently decided that if I wouldn't sign papers voluntarily, he would simply start acting as though the decision had already been made. He told the locksmith, a young man named Tomas who looked deeply uncomfortable the entire time, that his father was moving to assisted care, and the locks needed to be changed for security while the house was prepared for sale. I came outside in my robe, coffee in hand, and found my son and daughter standing on my own porch, watching a stranger change the locks on my own front door, without my knowledge or consent. What in God's name are you doing? I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Dad, it's just a precaution, Robert said. We talked to a lawyer, given your age and... Given my age, I'm 68, not 98. I ran a business for 30 years. I balanced our books, filed our taxes, kept this family fed and clothed and housed while your mother taught 3rd grade. I have never once forgotten to lock a door in my life. You've been different since Mom died, Susan said, and there was something in her voice that I recognized now for what it was, not concern, but rehearsal. She had practiced this. Isolated, forgetful, we're worried. I looked at Tomas, the locksmith, who had stopped working entirely and was staring at his shoes. Stop, I told him, don't touch that door again. Sir, I was just told. I don't care what you were told. This is my house. My name is on the deed, not his. I pointed at Robert. Mine, get your things and get off my property, and you too. I turned to my children, get off my porch. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Robert's face shifted into something I'd never seen on him before. Not disappointment, not hurt, but cold calculation. The look of a man recalculating a strategy that had just failed. You're not thinking clearly, he said. This is exactly the kind of behavior the lawyer talked about. Erratic, defensive. It's not going to look good, Dad, if this goes to a judge. A judge, I repeated. We don't want it to come to that, Susan said quickly, but if you won't cooperate. Get out, I said, and this time I didn't raise my voice at all. I didn't need to. Both of you now. They left. Tomas apologized quietly on his way to his van and told me, almost as an afterthought, that he hadn't actually changed anything yet. He'd only gotten as far as removing the old cylinder. I thanked him, gave him $50 for his trouble, and stood alone on my porch as his van pulled away, watching the street where I had taught 3 children to ride bicycles, feeling something in my chest crack open that had nothing to do with Margaret's death and everything to do with the 2 people who had just tried to take my home out from under me. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the folder Robert had left weeks earlier, and for the first time, I read every page. And then I did something I hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. I cried not for her this time, but for the family I thought I still had. When the tears stopped, something else took their place. Clarity. Part 4. What they never knew. Here is what my children did not know, because I had never told them, because Margaret and I had always believed some things were nobody's business but our own. 14 years earlier, after my drinking nearly cost me my marriage, Margaret and I sat down with a lawyer, not the family lawyer Robert would later try to recommend, but an old friend of mine named Harold Nguyen, a man I trusted with my life, and we restructured everything. The house was placed into a living trust, with Margaret and me as co-trustees. Upon either of our deaths, full control passed to the surviving spouse. Upon both our deaths, the house and remaining assets would be distributed according to terms we set together, terms our children had never seen, because we had never shown them. We didn't do it because we distrusted our children. We did it because Margaret's own mother had gone through something similar, siblings fighting over a dying woman's estate before she was even in the ground, and Margaret swore it would never happen to her own family. I thought she was being overly cautious. 14 years later, sitting at my kitchen table with a folder full of documents meant to strip me of my own home, I understood she had simply been right, the way she was right about most things. Legally, none of what Robert attempted would have worked. The power of attorney form required my signature and a notary. I'd signed nothing. The house could not be sold without my consent as sole surviving trustee. Even the locksmith incident, while infuriating, was not something a judge would take seriously as evidence of incompetence. A son changing his father's locks without permission is not proof of a father's decline, it's proof of a son's overreach. But I didn't call Harold that night to ask about my legal protections. I already knew I was protected. I called him to talk about something else entirely, a decision Margaret and I had discussed, quietly, in the last months of her illness, when she was still lucid enough to talk about the future she wouldn't get to see. If they ever try something like this, she told me, holding my hand in that hospital bed, her voice thin but certain, you do what we talked about, don't wait for me, don't wait for anything. You take care of yourself, Daniel. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Part 5. The final decision. I gave my children 6 weeks of silence. No calls returned, no visits allowed past the porch. I needed the time not to plan revenge, though I won't pretend the thought never crossed my mind, but to grieve properly and to think clearly about what came next. During those 6 weeks, I did the things Margaret and I had planned. I met with Harold twice. I visited a property 40 minutes north, a small lakeside cottage with 2 bedrooms and a dock, the kind of place Margaret used to circle in real estate listings, the way other people circle vacation destinations they'll never actually visit. I met with a financial advisor. I made calls I had been putting off for years. And then I called a family meeting, my terms, my house, my kitchen table. Robert, Susan, and Mark arrived within minutes of each other on a Sunday afternoon, all 3 looking wary, like they'd been summoned to something they couldn't predict. I made coffee. I sat them down at the same table where Margaret and I had eaten 10,000 meals together, where we'd helped each of them with homework, celebrated birthdays, argued about curfews. I want to tell you what I've decided, I said, about the house and about your mother's and my estate. I watched Robert's posture straighten, the old calculation returning to his eyes. The house is going up for sale, I said, and I saw something like triumph flash across his face before I continued. I've decided to sell it myself on my own timeline to a young family I met through the listing, a couple with 2 small children who reminded me a great deal of your mother and me 30 years ago. I'm closing next month. Dad, that's great, Robert said, recovering quickly, already recalculating. I can help you figure out how to divide the... I'm not finished, I said. I told them about the cottage. I told them I would be moving there alone, that I had already put down a deposit, that I intended to spend whatever years I had left somewhere Margaret, and I had once dreamed of retiring together, fishing off a dock in the mornings, exactly as she'd wanted. Then I told them about the money. The sale of the house, combined with the savings Margaret and I had built over 4 decades, came to just over $600,000. I told them that a portion, enough to cover the cottage and a comfortable retirement, I was keeping for myself. I told them the rest, the majority, was not going to be divided 3 ways as they clearly expected. Your mother and I set up a scholarship fund years ago in her name for students at the school where she taught, I said. It's currently modest. I'm endowing it fully. Every year, for as long as I'm able, it will send a graduating senior who couldn't otherwise afford it to college. That was always the plan, long before any of this happened. Susan's face went pale. Robert's jaw was working like he was chewing on words he didn't dare say yet. And the rest, he finally asked. The rest is going into a trust, I said, for my grandchildren's education. Not for you, for them. Emily, Josh, and little Claire. I want them to have what your mother and I worked our whole lives to give you, without worrying whether their parents will spend it on something else. You're cutting us out, Robert said, and for the first time, his voice cracked with something that sounded almost like real emotion. I'm not cutting you out of my life, I said. You're my children, and I love you, and that will never change, no matter what you did these past few months. But I'm not leaving either of you a dime of what your mother and I built, and I want you to understand exactly why. I looked at each of them, one at a time. Your mother spent her last conscious weeks worried you would try to take my home before I'd even finished grieving her. She was right. You changed the locks on my house 4 days after her funeral. You brought a lawyer to convince me I was losing my mind, and questioned whether I could remember to lock my own doors, while I was the one holding your mother's hand as she died. You did all of this not because you were worried about me, but because you saw an old man alone and a house worth $400,000, and you thought grief had made me weak enough to take it. Nobody spoke. Mark had tears running down his face. Susan was staring at the table. Robert's hands were clenched into fists on his knees. I'm 68 years old, I said. Not senile, not helpless, not confused. I'm a man who loved his wife for 42 years and who is going to spend whatever time I have left honoring her on my own terms, in a house by a lake she never got to see but always wanted. And I'm going to make sure my grandchildren have a future because that's what she would have wanted, and because you three have shown me very clearly what you would have done with anything I left in your hands. I stood up from the table. You can stay for coffee, I said, or you can go, but this conversation is over and my decision is final. Robert left without a word. Susan cried and asked if there was anything she could do to fix things. I told her that time and honesty and showing up for the right reasons instead of the wrong ones might be a start, but that trust, once broken like that, isn't repaired with a single conversation. Mark stayed the longest. He sat across from me at that kitchen table, the same one, and told me he was ashamed of himself for staying silent while it happened, that he should have called me the moment Robert brought up changing the locks, that he'd let fear of conflict cost him a chance to be the son he wanted to be. It's not too late, I told him. It's never too late until it is. I sold the house 6 weeks later to the young couple with the 2 children, who cried when I told them the story of the backyard wedding, of the 18-year mortgage, of every meal cooked in that kitchen. I moved into the cottage by the lake in early summer, and some mornings I sit on the dock with my coffee and watch the water the way Margaret always said she wanted to, and I talk to her quietly about the life we built and the decision I made to protect what was left of it. The scholarship fund sent its first full-ride student to college that fall, a girl named Aaliyah who wants to become a teacher, just like Margaret was. I keep a photo of her acceptance letter on my refrigerator. Robert has called twice since that Sunday. I've answered both times. We're not where we used to be, and I don't know if we ever will be. But healing, like grief, isn't something you rush. It's something you sit with, the way you sit with the setting sun over still water, waiting to see what comes next. I buried my wife in March. I found my spine in April. And in the quiet of a lakeside cottage she never got to see, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me all along, that love isn't just what you build together. Sometimes it's what you protect alone, when everyone else has already decided you're too weak to fight for it. I wasn't, and I never will be again.